Well, everyone, we get to finally talk about another BlackBerry phone this time around, and this time it's actually the BlackBerry Key 1. Now, this was a phone, unfortunately, BlackBerry, may they rest in peace. They are really not making any phones anymore. I think even BlackBerry Mobile, everything about this company is pretty much shutting down, but I will tell you, they had a very interesting run. Their phones at first were very popular, and most people thought, like an iPhone and even like an Android, they weren't going to go and upgrade to those phones because you need a keyboard for your phone. How do you have a phone and not have a keyboard and buttons and all this stuff? And since then, we've kind of upgraded, and it's crazy to think that even a phone like this that looks the way that it does came out in 2017, about 5 years ago. Now, this phone came out the same year as the iPhone X, as the Galaxy S8, and when you look at those phones and you look at this one, it does look a lot different. It does look dated as well, especially compared to nowadays, but you do have to understand, people were buying this phone because of the, keyboard. People were buying this phone because of BlackBerry. They love the BlackBerry, they love the keyboard, and they love having a physical keyboard like this. But again, when you look at this phone nowadays, you can see why most people have elevated to something like the Samsung Galaxy or to an iPhone, even like a Google Pixel, mostly because of probably the hardware. Maybe this wasn't like the greatest camera or the greatest this or that, but I do think a lot more people probably were just frustrated with BlackBerry and a lot of these different operating systems, probably due to the fact that all these other phones were having these crazy cool features, and a company like BlackBerry really focused in, I guess, on that keyboard side of things, where they should have really been focusing on improving the software over time, improving the cameras, improving the speed, different things like that, which we'll get into in a second. But on the front of this phone, you did have a 4.5-inch IPS panel on the front. It's a full HD panel, and it's still actually not a bad panel. I mentioned this for a while now. BlackBerry, especially the BlackBerry Priv, that was one of my favorite phones of all time, to be honest. I feel like if BlackBerry stuck that way out and having like such a beautiful AMOLED display and all that stuff, that would have been amazing. But this one took a little bit of a different approach. I still think the panel on the front isn't bad. It's just not my cup of tea. I like OLED panels more, but this one isn't that bad, and I do think it still kind of holds up decently well. You did have a front-facing camera on the front, and it's a very interesting looking phone because you actually do have the capacitive buttons on the bottom. So you have the home button, the recent button, and the back button as well. Those are pretty much in place, so you can't really do anything about it, which is very strange. And you did have that keyboard on the bottom as well. Now, this keyboard was really nice, but the thing with me, I have pretty fat fingers, so even clicking on them now, it just doesn't really hold up too well, which can be annoying. And that's why I like having a phone with a bigger screen, because you can kind of customize that keyboard. You can't really customize this keyboard at all because it's a hardware keyboard. I like having that fingerprint sensor in that spacebar though. I think that was really cool, but I do think, if it works for you, then it works for you. I wouldn't personally go and use this phone anymore, but if you were to use this phone, you know what you're getting with and you're probably happy with it. Now, you did have the charging port on this thing, you had a headphone jack, you also had a micro SD card slot on this phone too, which was really cool. Again, having a micro SD card slot is awesome, and I don't care if it's on a BlackBerry or whatever, that is a really, really cool feature, and I just wish more manufacturers would end up bringing it back. Now, on the back of this phone, you did have this somewhat like plastic back, which was very interesting. It wasn't removable, so there's nothing you can really do about it, but you did have the single camera on the back as well, and we might as well go and hit on the cameras. This thing had a 12 megapixel camera on the back, and it had an 8 megapixel camera on the front. Now, this is really not that great of a camera anymore, which is kind of unfortunate because I feel like BlackBerry, if they could have done one thing right, they should have just really went down on the camera and marketed themselves as one of the best camera phones, very similar to how Google and the Pixel lined up at first. That's kind of what they were marketing as. I feel like a lot of people really gravitate to that, even though they probably don't use their camera that much. I personally don't use my camera that much on my phone at all, but on top of that, you have to look at the landscape back in 2017. A lot of those phones could not do 4K at 60 on the back, and with the BlackBerry Key 1, you could do 4K at 30, which I think was good enough. This was 5 years ago, so I think since then, it's pretty dated. We're now getting 8K capability on a lot of phones now, so having 4K at 30 is pretty dated, as well as the 8 megapixel camera on the front. It's not really that great, and 1080p at 30 also isn't really that good anymore either. I would expect at the bare minimum 4K at 30, but most of them go up to 4K at 60 now. So when you compare this phone to phones nowadays, it is a bit dated when it comes down to that. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. You don't want to go get a phone and already have it outdated in terms of the camera setup. And if you're personally okay with the keyboard and you like having that type of keyboard and everything, you will be kind of probably disappointed with this camera. So again, I don't want to hate on this phone too much, but it is one of those things to keep in mind. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up there. Now in terms of the software, this is probably one of the more disappointing aspects, or one of the weirder aspects of this phone. So it actually had pretty stock Android. There really wasn't like anything super crazy with it. There wasn't really that much bloatware. There were some BlackBerry applications that were built in, and it came with like the usual Android applications that, most people would end up, deleting or whatever. But the thing with this phone was that it really was stock Android, which I liked, but it didn't get too many versions of Android after it. From what I know, it started with Android 7, it ended with Android 8, and even if it got Android 9 or whatever, this is the problem with a lot of these BlackBerry phones, and this is where Samsung is starting to really improve at. They know they need the software longevity, and the years of like, it gets a 1 version or 2 versions of Android, it's over now. Google's really improved, Samsung's improved, so that little stipulation of, if you have an iPhone, it's going to last way longer, it may still last longer, but it's not going to last as long as you would think. But it may not last as long as you would think compared to something like the, Samsung Galaxy or whatever. It's crazy. But with the BlackBerry, it sits in a very interesting spot. I don't think it's like a bad performing phone. I don't think it was like bad software. It just didn't really last that long, which is kind of unfortunate. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance, this phone has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 625 chipset inside, and Adreno 506 GPU, and a couple of different models. The base model had 3GB of RAM, the top tier model had 4GB of RAM, and as I mentioned before, this phone's performance, I really don't think it was that bad. It did have a watered down chipset of that year as far as I know, and that is kind of an unfortunate thing. This wasn't like a super cheap phone at that time either, so that was kind of unfortunate. I do think when it comes down to comparing to other phones in 2017, it would fit in line with something like a budget tier phone of that year. And I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it is one of those things to keep in mind. It is still like actually not that bad. I do think the stock Android actually helps it out a lot, but it really depends on what you're going to do with it. A lot of professionals ended up buying this phone or buying phones like this mostly because it was great for the keyboard and it was great for, I guess, productivity because of that keyboard and stuff. But I do think nowadays it really doesn't matter, because just because a phone has a keyboard on it, it doesn't mean you're more productive or more professional than somebody who doesn't have a keyboard on their phone. And I do think that actually ends up causing a little bit more of an issue than not. I also do think because of the way this phone was situated, kind of with the panel being a little bit more like rectangular squarish, a lot of these applications end up kind of looking a little bit weird. It wasn't anything crazy, but it was one of those things to keep in mind. And I do think this phone is kind of a decent performing phone nowadays, but it's really not like crazy amazing, but it is one of those things to keep in mind. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up there. And ultimately what I will tell you is I think this phone pretty much is not really worth it in 2022 anymore, but that doesn't mean it was a bad phone, of all time. I think this phone is still a very interesting phone. I wouldn't recommend buying it because it is severely outdated with software. If this thing was still updated to the recent version of Android, that'd be different, but because this thing stopped like 3, 4, 5 Android versions ago, it really doesn't make that much sense at all to purchase this thing. Even when this thing came out at that time, I think this thing was already outdated with software, to be honest. And the fact that, it's still in this weird situation where it's not getting any more updates, the company that made this phone is, pretty much going out of business and they're not making phones anymore, you have to kind of, move on to something else. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's actually kind of like more of a novelty than anything, but I wouldn't recommend buying this phone anymore. It makes absolutely no sense to purchase this device, and I would recommend buying something like a Google Pixel, a Samsung Galaxy, or an iPhone. Go with those phones, do not go with the BlackBerry in 2022, and that's pretty much how I'd kind of sum it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.